The group of films that we were asked to judge was quite heavily past tense style of documentaries, telling stories that had already happened. I'm one of the filmmakers that makes contemporary observational films, cinema verite, and so in a way it was slightly frustrating not to see more of those in, to be frank, but at the same time the past tense stories were told very imaginatively, and the range was very interesting to be able to compare styles of telling past tense stories. The jury discussion was interesting because a lot of us disagreed about our favorite films and the ones we weren't going to vote for. And sometimes people were very irritated by something like the graphics in one film or not that all the rest of us liked. In another case, it was something where people felt the pace was just too slow, even though the rest of us liked it. In another case, it was because it was too familiar to them, but not to us. So the perspectives were interestingly varied, even though 4 out of the 5 of us are documentary makers. So it was quite a rich exchange. And one of the films, which I'm not giving anything away, but is actually well worth people watching, I have to say, is Beware Mr. Baker, which was in a convention of its own, a music film about Ginger Baker, the drummer. But all of us, as it were, none of us, are used to watching music films of that kind. And it sort of laps the track in sensibility because it isn't just a music film about a great drummer. It's about a really unpleasant guy, and the filmmaker isn't all that pleasant himself. And the feeling that we all were almost excited by was being let in on the world of somebody as unpleasant as that. Because most documentaries, you sort of like the people that it's made about. And this was very different, and the style was different, and the intensity, and of course the music was amazing. So it was a treat for all of us, actually. I think there's a difference between cinema documentaries and television documentaries, because television at least is able to say, if you've got access to this, you don't know what's going to happen next, but the access is good enough, the institution's interesting enough, there's the police, hospitals, schools, things like that, that you don't actually have to tell people the finished story. You can't, in fact. But in cinema documentaries, because you have to raise the money, very often you really have to say to people, here's a great story and this is how it ends, and we're going to follow it. Now, interestingly, some of the miscarriage of justice cases mixed that. They had started filming in earlier stages of those stories, and then as other things happened, people were let out of prison, whatever, that kind of produced a sort of immediacy which makes the films a mix of past and present. And I think in some ways that's the most interesting form of storytelling, where you can set the scene, where you think you know where you're going, and then suddenly, as life so often does, it takes a 90-degree turn, and that's why we make documentaries instead of just writing the scripts in advance. West of Memphis, for example, follows people who were clearly wrongly convicted of killing a number of boys in Tennessee, and the journey from the original conviction and the protests against those boys, because there was a kind of mob rule there, and then the gradual discovery over time, because of the campaign group, of DNA and things that simply exonerated them after they'd done a long time in prison, ends with their release from prison, and that's very powerful as a journey. I'm also a criminologist, and I'm particularly interested in the way DNA has actually allowed people to go back over convictions that were clearly wrong and produce objective evidence. Because there's a lot of tension, very interesting, in the miscarriage of justice stories, that there's a kind of ethos at the time. Central Park 5 is another example, where in the late 80s, quite recently, in New York, the level of racism was so intense, and the level of fear and paranoia about young black men, that the young black men in question, the 5, really couldn't get a fair trial because they were needed as scapegoats. So the sloppy police work, the forcing them into giving confessions, was not just bad police work, it was a reflection at the time that they had to be thrown to the wolves to satisfy the media, to satisfy public opinion, and so on. So it's a particular time that's reflected in these historical stories, and then they're brought up to date as technology like DNA and other somebody actually confesses in that film 13 years later after they've been in prison for 13 years. And you just think, this is too horrible. And the fact that it's real is why we make documentaries, but it has the extra power of being real and not just a kind of denouement for a film like Dead Man Walking or something.
I look back at the Jogger case and wish I had been more skeptical as a journalist. You know, a lot of people didn't do their jobs. Reporters, police, prosecutors, defense lawyers. This was a proxy war being fought. And these young men were the proxies for all kinds of other agendas. And the truth and the reality and justice were not part of it.
I think what makes documentaries special is A, that they're real, and that's why for me reconstruction is a problem. You have to really do it at the service of the story. And B, that it's a world that exists that most people who are watching don't know. So for example, the child abuse film, Mea Maxima Culpa, even if people are Catholic, they do not know about how the abuse happened, particularly in a school for deaf children. And the power of those interviews with deaf kids, who are now adults, is just extraordinary. And that is a great documentary sequence because, I don't know how to talk to deaf people unless there's sort of subtitles in the conversation, so to speak. And in this film, you really do see their world through their eyes, and the abuse, which is a bit more familiar, takes on an extra dimension because they're deaf. And so that poignancy is great documentary making because it's layer after layer. Abuse, bad. Revelation about the abuse, good. Revelation about cover-ups, good. But dealing with characters as compelling as that, even stronger. So you have a kind of merger of all these ingredients, climaxed by this use of film to get into the heads and memories of deaf people who have survived this terrible abuse. It's a wonderful sequence, and it's a terrific film.
When I first entered St. John's, I loved it. In the confessional booth, there was a dividing wall, but there was a little space, so you could sign back and forth, and he would bless you. And he told me to take off my pants. I kept it a secret.
Whenever you're a juror, there's some films you know are not going to win, and then there's a group of films you think could win. And what the process is about is first eliminating the films that really don't have a chance, but with proper discussion, and then trying to debate qualities. And I'm afraid very often, and this was no exception, you're debating apples, oranges, pears, grapes, bananas, and giraffes. Sometimes it's as diverse as that. And so one of the, that is almost the hardest part of being a juror, is comparing a music film with a historical film with a contemporary observational film. And, they're not, as it were, in competition with each other, except in this case they are.